Hi, welcome to Learning Module 12 on Informal Caregiving. Again, as a reminder and to tie in the last 4 modules together, 3 of which were on formal caregiving and this one now on informal caregiving, informal caregiving is unpaid care, usually provided by friends, family, relatives, or volunteers, and usually provided in the home. But again, I want to reiterate that the defining criterion between formal and informal care is whether or not it is paid. And in this case, informal care is unpaid care. Okay, the learning objective for this module is that by the end of this module, you will be able to explain why the majority of informal caregivers of the elderly are in fact women. Now we have 4 required readings associated with this module, and I'm going to go through each one of them separately. The first is another introductory essay by Stoller and Gibson to one of the parts of the book Worlds of Difference, and this is on the diversity of American families. Stoller and Gibson want to dispel the myth of the traditional or typical nuclear family in America of a husband, a wife, and 2.5 children and a dog and a white picket fence and all of that. They want to point out that this is a myth and it never really depicted the majority of households. It was particularly unique to the post-World War II period, but even then the majority of families did not fit this model. This was largely a white upper middle class model of family life, if even that. So Stoller and Gibson want to point out that there is a wide range of diversity in family structures, and that is even more important today, where we see blended families, single-parent families, same-sex families, grandparents raising children, all manner of family structures. And Stoller and Gibson want us to be aware that there is no one monolithic family structure, that there are a variety of family structures, all of which are legitimate. All right, the next reading is by Ella Lefland called The Linden Tree. And this is a reading about a long-time gay couple. In other words, they've been in a relationship that is longer than some straight marriages exist, but it is a unique relationship. It is a relationship between George and Giulio, and George is a black man and Giulio is Italian, so they are an interracial gay couple. As a result of this couple that has been in a long-term relationship, a long-term committed relationship, has experienced both racism as well as homophobia, and thus they end up in their old age with only one another to care for them. Now Giulio becomes ill, and it is George who becomes his primary caregiver. George is the stoic in the relationship. If anything, he takes on the stereotypical masculine roles of taking care of the bills, taking care of the property, while Giulio is the more emotional, effeminate part of this relationship, and he enjoys gardening and whatnot. But they have a division of labor in the home that is very similar to much division of labor in the home, and it works for them as a long-term couple. Now, even though George is a stoic, when Giulio becomes sick, you see that his tenderness for Giulio is ever present, and this is depicted in a very subtle way. When they sleep at night, they push the beds together, and George holds Giulio's hand. So he is his longtime partner, lover, and informal caregiver. The next is a poem by Anne Tracy, Between the Funerals. And what we have here is a Well, actually, it's a short story. It's not a poem. But it is, it packs a powerful punch in this respect. So we have a mother and a daughter who are at a mall, and they're shopping for wedding presents, and they come out of the mall and they are trying to locate their car. And in many circumstances, you can't remember where you parked. But in this circumstance, the mother is leading the daughter out of the mall, but then suddenly turns to the daughter and defers to the daughter and expects the daughter to lead. And what we have is a sudden switch in caregiving roles, where the daughter becomes the parent and the parent becomes the child in some respects, expecting the daughter to now take over the informal caregiving and lead the way. And this is indicative of how many caregiving roles turn about on a dime. Now, this is not true in all cases, but don't be surprised later in life if there comes one day when your parent looks to you and expects you to take the lead, and that's exactly what happens in Between the Funerals. The last is a story by Gerald Haslam. It's one of my favorite stories in this book, The Horned Toad. We have a blended family here. We have a blended family in a number of ways. We have an interracial couple who has taken the grandmother of the woman in the story into their home. It is a couple where the wife is a Spanish-speaking Mexican woman who also speaks English and is married to a white Anglo man, and they have a child. And they bring the child's great-grandmother into the home. Now, this is again not similar to a Kate Quinton situation where they're trying to pass great-grandma off on some family member to take care of her. This is a tight-knit group of relatives, group of Latina relatives who want only the best for the great-grandmother. The problem is this: the remainder of the family, the remainder of the relatives, all live in a city setting, and she grew up in the country. And this particular granddaughter and her husband and son live the closest to the setting with which she is most familiar, so she goes to live with them. Now, the husband isn't a fan of this. The Anglo husband isn't a fan of this at first. However, over the course of the story, you find that he makes a peace with his wife's grandmother by basically sharing cocktails with her on the porch at sunset. Now, the primary impact in this story is between the great-grandmother and the great-grandson. He's kind of terrified of her because she comes into the house and she doesn't speak English. She only speaks Spanish to him. But he learns soon enough that she understands English full well. And I can only imagine in the little boy's mind, oh my goodness, what if I said in front of great-grandmother that she understood perfectly well, but never indicated that she did. Now, the great-grandmother insists upon speaking Spanish to the boy because he's never learned Spanish, and so she takes on the role of the cultural conservator in the family to pass along the language and the cultural traditions to the great-grandson, and they develop a bond. Now, what about the horned toad? Well, the little boy decides that he wants to keep a toad as a pet, and so he takes it from across the street and brings it home and tries to keep it penned up as his pet. But the great-grandmother tells him that this toad has its own place, and it cannot be kept in a place that is not its natural surroundings, and insists he takes it back. But the little boy returns and takes the toad again and brings it back home. And the toad keeps trying to go back to its natural setting, and on one attempt, unfortunately, is run over. And that's the end of the toad. It's not the end of the story, however. The story ends when the great-grandmother dies, and the little boy plays a very important role because the relatives are all discussing where they're going to bury great-grandma. And because the majority of them live in the city, they're thinking that that would be the best place for her. But the little boy chimes in and says, no, she needs to return to her place. We need to bury her in the country. That's where she came from. The lesson he learned from the horned toad and his great-grandmother. Okay, so those are the readings. Next, I am going to cover a very important landmark study on informal caregiving that was done more than, let's see, it would be more than 2 decades ago. And the reason it is a landmark study is that it is a larger study that had been done up to that time or that has been done since. We're going to cover that. And then I'm going to introduce a poem by Charlotte Zolotow called William's Doll, which helps to explain the results of the study by Dwyer and Coward. Once we have covered both the Dwyer and Coward study and you have read the poem by Charlotte Zolotow, I want you to complete the assessment where you will use Dwyer and Coward, Kate Quinton's Days, I want you to integrate this as well, and William's Doll to explain why you think the majority of informal caregivers of the elderly are women, and to provide a suggestion for changing that dynamic so that we have more equitable caregiving responsibilities between both men and women. Okay, thanks.